Hi class, we have a lot to get through in chapter 21, so I'm just going to jump right into it. Today we're covering the 16th century art in Italy, also known as the late Renaissance. Your textbook calls it the High Renaissance, but I take some issues with that. You'll notice in your handout that I have high in quotation marks. I just always think that when you call something a time period like the Renaissance high, you're insinuating that whatever happened before it is somehow low. So we just learned that a lot of really great and important and artistically talented individuals were active during the early portion of the Renaissance, and so it's not really fair to them to call this next chapter the High Renaissance. So I like to call it the Late Renaissance. That's the explanation. The century that we're in, the 16th century, is also called the Cinquecento, following the Quattrocento, that was last century. We're going to see in this chapter a continuing interest in perspective, classical culture, classical proportions, right? All of that same stuff that we've been talking about for the past chapters, a couple chapters. Now, though, in most of Italy, we're going to see an increased interest in both science, medicine, and anatomy. So science, medicine, and anatomy are going to be important. In fact, the way that you're going to be able to tell a late Renaissance artist from an early Renaissance artist is that in the late Renaissance, they begin to be interested in anatomy. So they're getting so fastidious with the realism of the artwork that they're creating that they're going so far as to study basic human anatomy, the way that muscles work together, the way that tendons are attached, the way that your body responds to different poses of movement. All of that naturalistic, realistic qualities are going to make their way into the art. The popularity and the clout, or the respect of the artists that are going to come out of the Cinquecento, are going to send shockwaves through the perception of artists for the rest of history. It's during this time period that we see, artists becoming not only a respected profession, but a highly desirous and emulated profession. Artists are going to be respected as individuals, making contributions and revolutionizing a certain style. So we're going to see that all of the big names that we cover from the Cinquecento in this century are going to have their own unique spin or take on the style of the art that they produce, and they're going to be very easily recognizable, which is nice for you guys for when you have to go back and memorize them. Artists are also going to claim that they're getting divine inspiration, so it gives them a little bit of liberty. That and just the huge amount of respect that they demanded is going to give them a lot of freedom during this century that they didn't really enjoy in earlier centuries, and freedom that they're not really going to enjoy again in the next century. Well, we'll talk about why at the end of this, at the end of the chapter. We know a lot about these men that come out of the Cinquecento, because of a historian named Vasari, Vasari. He was a contemporary Renaissance historian, and he wrote biographies. He called his biography The Lives of the Most Excellent Artists, Architects, Painters, and Sculptors. And among some of his favorites were Michelangelo, Raphael. We already talked about Masaccio. He wrote about Masaccio, and Brunelleschi, that kind of thing. So because he has written down all of these great bits of information from their lives, we now know a lot about these artists as individuals with lives, not just a body of work, which is kind of interesting. In a way, you could maybe call Vasari the first art historian, but he really wasn't interested so much in the body of work that these artists were creating. Again, he was more about writing their biographies. We saw in our last chapter how Vitruvius's De Architectura, that book that was written by the first century CE architect Vitruvius, we saw how De Architectura was very influential in the work of the architect Alberti. But here you can see in our first piece that we're covering from the Italian late Renaissance, the Vitruvian man, that his work is also going to be very important and influential on another, at this point, young artist named Leonardo da Vinci. Now, technically, if you look up and you see the date, 1490, we're still in the Quattrocento right now, but Leonardo da Vinci was really the first late Renaissance artist. So the bulk of his work is going to come from the Cinquecento. Just right now we're still in the 1400s. Leonardo da Vinci started out as a scientist and an engineer primarily. He's the first of our examples of a Renaissance man. As a Renaissance man, you were expected to be well versed in all of what they defined as the liberal arts, so science, medicine, anatomy, botany, zoology, and then the arts, architecture, sculpture, drawing, and painting. You had to be able to do a little bit of all of it in order to be a true Renaissance man. That's what the term means. So he made sketches related to botany, geology, geography, as well as the body and classical literature. In this case, he's going through and trying to illustrate some of these design principles that were discussed by Vitruvius in his De Architectura. So, as we mentioned, Vitruvius' De Architectura did survive up until this point, but the pictures did not. So, Leonardo da Vinci is here in his famous Vitruvian Man drawing, trying to illustrate a principle of design that Vitruvius writes about. Vitruvius argued that ideally the perfectly proportioned figure should fit within a circle with the navel at the center within a square. This is a really hard design concept to grasp, that the body should fit within a circle within a square. And so here Leonardo da Vinci is brilliantly trying to illustrate what Vitruvius could mean by this, because of course Vitruvius's pictures were lost. So here we have the body within a circle. The navel is at the middle, and you can see that if the legs were to extend all the way around his head, it would continue that way. But his arms here fit at this point of the square, where the square is fitting at his feet and at the projection of his hands. Is it completely perfect? Absolutely not. But it is an interesting illustration of his of Vitruvius's work. So it is a good illustration of the interest in anatomy. You can see that his human body here has lots of muscle definition, specific muscle definition. It's kind of going into such exquisite anatomical detail in the legs and the muscles over the knees. Some people have even suggested that his Vitruvian Man might have had a hernia, but I don't know. So that's interesting. But this is really his first real attempt to get an accurate depiction of the musculature of the body. Another thing that you should take away from this Vitruvian Man statue is that the Renaissance is going to love symmetry and balance of composition, and they're going to love shapes that are very symmetrical, like squares and circles. Squares and circles are going to be the loves of the Renaissance for painting, for drawing, and for architecture. Earlier in Leonardo da Vinci's career, he painted this Annunciation scene, which is now at the Uffizi in Florence. Again, even though technically this is from the Quattrocento, we're talking about him in the Cinquecento because he's a late Renaissance artist. He really was kind of the first. He was very ahead of his time. The Annunciation scene we already know. It's Angel Gabriel coming down and informing Mary that she is pregnant. He's utilizing many of the Renaissance painting techniques that we've become very familiar with now. Primarily linear perspective. You can see some of these orthogonals here pointing back into the horizon line. And he's using aerial perspective, things that get blurrier towards the background. He's not using a lot of color. Leonardo da Vinci uses small, sort of muted patches of bold colors. So small areas of bold colors. And he doesn't use very many of them. You can see he only uses blue, red, maybe a little bit of green. Really not that much. Or a little bit of green over here. Really not that many bright colors. It's said about Leonardo da Vinci that when you look at his pieces, the light and the color has to fight against the darkness for prominence, which is kind of interesting. Leonardo da Vinci is using this very sort of late Quattrocento halos that are translucent and kind of disappearing into the background. They're going to eventually, in Leonardo da Vinci's work, completely disappear. Some of Leonardo da Vinci's interest in naturalism is present here, even though we are early in his career. One of the most telling aspects of Leonardo da Vinci's work in this Annunciation scene are the folds of this robe here. Leonardo da Vinci is going to be one of the first to try to study from real life when he's painting images of religious figures. So he would have someone sit for the figure of Mary. And because he couldn't have them sit long enough, or at least not as long as he wanted, he would dip the linen of the drapery in glue, sit it on the person's lap, and wait for it to set, and have the person and then remove the linen and be able to paint it from its glued position so that he could get all of this shading, light and air and shade areas perfectly right. He's also using chiaroscuro and trying to do some period correct articles of clothing, although she is reading a book, which we know is incorrect. His darkness that he's using is definitely a far cry or a huge contrast to the artificially bright worlds of the Quattrocento contemporaries. Here's a really good illustration of one of Leonardo da Vinci's work and what really is going to set him aside from the early Renaissance. So Leonardo da Vinci studied under Verrocchio, who was a sculpture artist. And so they both at one point were commissioned to do portraits of Ginevra da Vinci, who was a really interesting female Renaissance individual. She was she was not an artist herself, but she was a great art patron and from a really noble royal family. So here's Leonardo da Vinci's portrait of her, and then here's one of Verrocchio's sculptures of her. This is a really good time to mention Leonardo da Vinci's particular type of chiaroscuro. So we already defined chiaroscuro as the arrangement of light and shadow in a painting to give it three-dimensional or sculptural form or sculptural mass. Leonardo da Vinci's type of chiaroscuro is called sfumato. Sfumato in Italian means kind of, well, smoky. And he gets this name because, as you can see, he has these shadows that are very pervasive. It's very dark, as I mentioned in the last slide. And they kind of cover his entire form with this sort of smoky, well-blended effect. So her face here is very, very dark, and you can compare it to, if you were to light this statue very dramatically from one angle, as it is right here, you can only see the areas that are getting hit by the light, like the top of her cheekbones and her nose, whereas the rest of it is in shadow. Very similar to Leonardo da Vinci's smoky cheek that you see right here. This is really what I'm talking about. And here's where I can show you the illustrated contrast between Leonardo da Vinci's sfumato and this sort of artificially bright world of the Quattrocento. This is why Leonardo da Vinci, although technically still in the Quattrocento, is considered one of the Cinquecento artists. So if you forget, this is a painting done by Ghirlandaio. Ginevra da Vinci's avoidance of our glance and her refined stoic emotionality were traits of social refinement during the Renaissance. So she looks kind of mean and not really looking at us, and it just means that she was a well-bred lady. Just to illustrate how dark Leonardo da Vinci's work is and why it is so dark, it's really illustrative to look at one of his understudies or one of his underdrawings. This is Leonardo da Vinci's Adoration of the Magi. It is an unfinished work. This is just an underdrawing. It's a celebrated example of linear and aerial perspective, as well as form and shape and shadow, despite it being monochromatic and it being completely unfinished. The Italian Renaissance painters in both Florence and Milan and Rome are going to be very much interested in disegno. Disegno is line. So outlining the arrangement of these lines as they form to create a solid composition. That's disegno. Comes from the word for design. It also comes from the word for drawing. So disegno has to do with doing a lot of these underdrawing and preparatory sketches. A preparatory sketch like this would sometimes be called a cartoon as well. Cartoons are studies for a painting, usually done in a separate medium. This excellent example of disegno and this example of a cartoon shows you just how dark Leonardo da Vinci planned this scene to be, because he's going to paint over these areas that he's already colored in black. And you can probably tell if you've ever taken a painting class that when you sketch something out, when you use disegno, you don't usually use this much darkness. You save it for when you go back and add paint. But the fact that he's already made it dark makes you realize just how dark he had planned it to be. So his compositions are always very dark, even in his underdrawing. Dark people get very, poetic when talking about Leonardo da Vinci, and your book says that to Leonardo da Vinci, darkness was universal and light had to fight its way through. Now let's look at a complete painting by Leonardo da Vinci. This is his Madonna of the Rocks. It's one of 4 paintings that made their way from Italy to France during Leonardo da Vinci's lifetime. He flees to France for a while, and he takes some paintings with him to give as a gift. So this is one of them. It's an excellent example of disegno, of design, and composition of his forms. You can see that it is primarily supposed to be a trio of Mary, John the Baptist, and Jesus, with an onlooking angel. But they make this great compositional triangle from the heads down here, from the fingers of the angel and Christ's blessing, directing it back that way, of the prayers that are issued by little baby John the Baptist back to Christ. There's all of this great hierarchical sort of balance and structure to his composition, which the Renaissance did love. Again, he's choosing a very muted color palette and a very, very dark construction. So you can definitely talk about the darkness of his underdrawing and the mutedness of his colors as the light has to fight its way through. You can also talk about sfumato, this smoky, hazy chiaroscuro that makes its way across his painting in all of these shadows. Very well blended form of chiaroscuro. Light fights its way through the darkness. His scene is also very much more emotionally compelling than many of these other scenes that we've studied. It's interesting that the person who commissioned this work of Leonardo da Vinci requested a scene with Madonna, Mary, and child surrounded by angels. And so the person might have been expecting something similar to what we saw from the, way back in the Trecento, which all of those Madonna and Child surrounded by angels, the one by Cimabue and the one by Giotto. That probably is what they were expecting and what they were hoping for, but they should have known better with Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci was known not only for his study of anatomy, which also is displayed here. These babies look a little bit more baby-like than babies that we've seen in the past, especially those Trecento babies of Giotto and Cimabue. He was also very interested in psychology, and this is an aspect of humanism that we talked about a little bit in the last chapter, trying to get to know what makes people unique and different from one another in our brains, in the way that we react to things, that everyone's going to react differently. So he has this sort of melting mood of intimate tenderness, of privacy, and of comfort that's very visually united and also very spatially convincing in his mathematical technicalities, although technically he's not able to show us his orthogonals because there's no architecture. He is using linear perspective, one-point linear perspective, as well as aerial perspective. He places all of his scenes in these ambiguous, rocky landscapes that look kind of eerie, but also at the same time very intimate. So they're not really an artificial gold background heavenly scene, but it's also not a recognizable scene. It's certainly not a contemporary scene, the way that they were doing in the Northern Renaissance. Hopefully you remember that from a couple chapters ago. But it's still something that you could feel yourself melting into. His scenes are very intimate, and this is also quite a large piece. Arguably the most famous of Leonardo da Vinci's works has to be The Last Supper, so of course I had to put it on here and I had to star it. Although I don't really love talking about it because you can probably tell it's in such a poor state of preservation that it's truly, truly confusing to a lot of my students, because up until now we've been talking about Leonardo da Vinci's use of sfumato and darkness and you just don't get a sense for that here. But it's not because this is the way that Leonardo da Vinci had intended it to be. Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper fresco that you're looking at here started deteriorating while he was still alive. He goes to Milan, where he is asked by a fraternity of monks to paint a scene for their refectory. A refectory is like a cafeteria. So you're thinking about a monastery and you're thinking about a cafeteria. The Last Supper is going to be your obvious choice for depiction. There's where they go to eat. So let's think about the Last Supper. So Leonardo da Vinci paints his Last Supper scene above what at one point was broken through and made into a door. You can see this door was added later, but a small refectory room, a small dining room. The rest of the frescoes are gone missing. Leonardo da Vinci, we haven't mentioned this yet, but he preferred to work in oil paints, despite the fact that they were not very popular in Italy, except in Venice. They were popular in Venice. He preferred to work with oil paints because they allowed him more time to carefully plan and construct his compositions. He did not like that fresco was such a quick medium, that you had to come in and paint everything that you wanted to paint in one day and then move on to the next area the next day. He liked to be able to go back and retouch his different and older portions so that he could better create this complete, cohesive light and shadow. He liked to have all of his colors be very uniform, and we saw that in frescoes, sometimes the colors will look different from one day to the next. He didn't really like frescoes because they were too quick, and he liked to really take his time. He was quite a perfectionist. So when asked to paint a fresco for this Milan refectory, this Milan monastery, he decides to try to modify the technique of making fresco painting. So he does not paint on wet plaster, as buon fresco is supposed to be, but he paints on fresco secco, meaning that he paints on dried plaster. And he doesn't use traditional fresco paints, but he uses a combination of fresco paints and oil paints because, as I said, oil paint takes a lot longer to dry, and he liked that long drying time because it gave him time to go back and touch up different areas as he completed his composition, as he completed his disegno, or his design and drawing. However, the problem is that as wet plaster dries with paint on it, it will absorb that paint and create a very solid and sound construction. The paint is not going to go anywhere once it dries into the plaster. The plaster might fall off the wall, but it will still be attached to the paint. When you paint on dry plaster, and as he was painting, small particles of water and moisture were present between the layers of the plaster and the paint itself. And as it dried, the humidity in the air of Milan began to expand the water droplets, and the piece started to fall apart. It started to fall apart, as I said, while Leonardo da Vinci was still alive. We know this because the monks actually sent a petition to him when he was in France and asked him to please come back and fix it because it was falling apart. It was, however, superbly famous at the time, even though it was falling apart, even though technically it wasn't exactly a success with his medium. The reason why this piece is so startlingly famous is because it's such a great study in psychology, in Leonardo da Vinci's interest in psychology. The scene itself is the Last Supper. So Christ and his apostles, or his 12 followers, are sitting around the dining table, and Christ makes the announcement that tomorrow one of his followers are going to betray him, and that he's going to die, and that this is the last meal that they're going to share. As he shares this, everyone around the table jumps back in startled shock, or some of them are angry. You can see this guy pointing upwards. He's mad at Christ. This guy's in sort of shocked denial, like, what could you possibly be talking about? This guy is sad. I like this figure. He's pointing at him like, what do you know what he's talking about? Like, this guy's crazy. Everyone's reacting in their own personal way, and that's the study in psychology. Leonardo da Vinci went back and he reread the Bible with great attention to detail in the characters, in the individual characters, and he thought that he tried to capture all of their personalities. Honestly, I couldn't tell you which one is which, but I do know this figure over here is Peter, and that this figure right here is Judas, which is very interesting that Judas would be right here. Those of you who are familiar with the story know that it is actually going to be Judas who betrays him. And so Judas is holding onto a little bag of money, which you can't exactly make out because of the poor preservation of the fresco, but he's holding the money that the Romans have paid him to betray Christ. So it's an interesting study in character as each of the apostles are sort of searching their own souls with their individual character. He also is applying his study of math and mathematical unity. He has Christ, the central figure. Obviously, he's this sort of triangular composition central figure, and everyone's sort of directing attention to him, so you can't really miss him. But then if you look at the apostles, you have 4 groups of 3. So he's divided the 12 apostles into 4 groups of 3. So that's mathematically very impressive. He's also using linear perspective. You can see some of his orthogonals pointing this way. You can see if you followed these lines straight down, the vanishing point would be somewhere around Christ's head. Same from the side this way. These are tapestries hanging from the walls. And then this way as well. Once you start to draw them, you realize all of these points here are making a beeline right for the vanishing point on the horizon line, which is Christ's head. He's also using a bit of aerial perspective. You can see the scene out in the background is not very well defined, and that's partially due to the poor preservation of the fresco, but it's also due to the fact that he's using aerial perspective. So things in the background, aerially, atmospherically, are going to become blurrier than things in the foreground. Where have the halos gone? We've been getting to this. The halos have been getting thinner and thinner and more translucent until finally in Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper we can see that they are gone. Halos were really supposed to represent the superhuman quality of these what were thought to be divine figures. The superhuman quality is going to directly clash with the idea of humanism. In humanism, they're going to be interested in the figure of Christ as a human being, not as a superhero, not as a divine figure, but as a suffering mortal human, at least for the period of time that he was on earth. And so he and all of his followers are missing their halos. Their halos are gone because Leonardo da Vinci believed that it detracted or brought people out of the scene, and it distracted them from the intimacy of the moment and the spontaneity of the moment. Again, remember the Renaissance, they're trying to show the scene as it would have taken place in real life. So wearing period pieces, this idea that you're looking into a window into the scene historically speaking, and the halos just put a level of artificiality into the scene that he didn't like. Now, that's not to say that it's completely without a halo. Some people have argued that the presence of this window directly behind Christ's head is supposed to act as a sort of pseudo halo or a fake halo. And obviously is functioning certainly as framing his face in a nice way. There's a lot that you can speak about in Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper as being sort of stylistic characteristics of the late Renaissance. The building itself suffered greatly during World War II. There were bombing raids outside of the monastery in Milan, and they had to pack bags of sand, up against the fresco to try to keep it preserved. It obviously was still slightly damaged. When you go to see it today, you have to make reservations long in advance. They only let a certain amount of people in to see it a day because people bring too much humidity that could continue and further the damage to the fresco. And before you get in to see it, you have to walk through this big dehumidifying chamber that just sucks all of the moisture out of you and your clothes. Obviously not allowed to bring any drinks or anything like that in to go see the fresco. Not in a great state of preservation. I almost don't like to show this picture to my students. When I show it to them, the reaction to it is usually one of a combination of relief and relief and excitement when they see it. This was supposedly a study by John Pietrino of Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. I told you it was very famous during Leonardo da Vinci's life, and this was done shortly after it was completed, only about 20 years post. So it was not in as bad a state as it is today. It was already starting to fall apart, but not as badly. So when students look at this is a really great sort of non-blurry study quality of what you're seeing. Most of the figures are still true to Leonardo da Vinci's work because it's supposed to be a copy. So you can see more clearly that this Judas figure here has his hand on the money bag that you couldn't really see in the first one. You can see some of the characters' faces more clearly. You can see, well, the wall tapestries that have designs on them that was completely missing from the last scene, as well as their feet underneath, which this is where there was a door blown through. So, however, you don't get a sense of these ceiling orthogonals, and we really can never be entirely sure how talented Gian Pietrino was at capturing sfumato. Remember, sfumato was a chiaroscuro type that was unique to Leonardo da Vinci, that he developed it, and he was one of the only ones working in it. So unless Gian Pietrino really knew and studied under Leonardo da Vinci, we should not take his Last Supper copy as a direct copy of Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, because he probably was not as talented as Leonardo da Vinci. So, but it is interesting to see. I do like to show it to my students. This is Leonardo da Vinci's Virgin and Child with Saint Anne. So here's the Virgin, Child, and Saint Anne. We're not going to talk about this too long. I think that this may have suffered some over cleaning. If you look at Mary's face here, she's just way too bright. Leonardo da Vinci's sfumato is very deep, and she's just way too bright. There's a problem when you go to clean. It's hard to tell the difference between black soot, smog, and dirt and gray-black paint. You think it would be easy, but it isn't. This is Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa, arguably his other most famous painting, although undeservedly so. If you go online under optional materials for this section, you can read an article on why the Mona Lisa is the most overrated painting in the history of art, because it really truly is. The Mona Lisa, if anyone's ever been to the Louvre in France and seen it, it's a very small little painting of someone, unidentified female figure. Really nothing that special. I mean, it's a Leonardo da Vinci, so it's very well done. It's accurate use of his perspective and sfumato, a lovely example of his sfumato and his ambiguous backgrounds and his intimacy and his study of anatomy, all of those things that we now know and love about Leonardo da Vinci. However, it's really not his best work. And it's not even his best work in the Louvre. If you go in the Louvre and you see it, everyone tries to crowd into this one small room to see it. And across the hallway on the other side, there are all these great, larger, full-scale paintings, among them Madonna and Child of the Rocks. So really not his best work. The reason why the Mona Lisa is so famous, is sort of summation, is because she was stolen. And the reason she was stolen is because she was, at the time that she was stolen in the early 1900s, she was so small and sort of not particularly famous that the person who stole her thought that he would be able to get away with selling her. Stealing art is not always the most profitable of things to steal, because once you steal it, it's very hard to find someone to buy it. No museum is going to buy something that you stole, or if they do, they're going to give it right back and report you. So trying to find someone to buy a large painting like his Madonna and Child of the Rocks would have been impossible. But at the time, no one really knew about this Leonardo da Vinci. It was very obviously Leonardo da Vinci's and so worth a lot of money, but not his most famous work. So the person who stole it thought he could get away with selling it. Long story short, he pretended to be a museum worker. He snuck into the Louvre. He cut her out of her frame with a box cutter. So she used to have two long columns on either side next to her, and actually the portrait continued well down a bit, so it actually covered well down below her waist. But she was cut out of her frame, rolled up and stuffed under a shirt, and snuck away. The museum, the Louvre staff went through such great lengths to try to get this painting back that they broadcast the picture all over the place, at least as much broadcasting as you could do in the early 19th century, posted a picture all over the place, and it became so famous because of their recovery efforts that the person who stole it was unable to sell it, and eventually he did return it to the museum. People were so grateful that he returned it to the museum and didn't set it on fire, which he very easily could have done. that they had equally as grand a party celebrating her return. And she became famous because of that. She became sort of the symbol of French culture, and how triumphant it is because they did, get it back in the end. And at the end of the day, everyone forgot exactly why she was famous, and they just knew that she was famous, and kind of became a Kim Kardashian effect. Anyway, but there is something about his Mona Lisa that is very captivating. Why would he have painted this seemingly not very wealthy, unknown female figure? He's painted Ginevra de Benci before. Why this lady? Why Mona Lisa? Mona is not her first name, by the way. Mona is a contraction of the word my lady, mia donna, Mona. So it's my lady Lisa. Don't know what her last name would have been. I've heard weird conspiracy theories that this is supposed to be Leonardo da Vinci in drag. I've heard theories that this might be a sister or a lover of his. We really don't know. There's no, one real true answer. But there is something also about that smile, that little smirk that she has, and the way that her eyes confront the viewer. There was a word for this in Italian at the time called sprezzatura. It's on your list there of important vocab words. Sprezzatura is an untranslatable word. It's an Italian word. It's untranslatable into English. It's a word for the nobilities, and for the upper classes' unconcern for the economic realities, unconcern for the financial realities of the real world. So this sort of smirk or haughtiness that she's displaying is primarily a quality that was reserved for nobility, for high class, and specifically a quality that was reserved for the male sex of this high class, of this patrician or high class society. So the fact that she's exhibiting this smirk is very interesting. So why is this low class woman displaying this high class quality, this smirk that she has? As an example, Leonardo da Vinci's portrait of Ginevra de Benci, she does not have this smirk, even though we do know that she was wealthy. So what is it about this woman that Leonardo da Vinci decides to give her this sprezzatura? It's interesting as well that Leonardo da Vinci is painting a woman here who does not seem to have come from upper class. It's probably a great humanist statement that he's making. Leonardo da Vinci was very proud of the fact that he came from nothing. He was a bastard. He had no, legitimate father. He was a peasant, came from nothing. He showed distinguishable artistic talent, and he was brought up through the guild system. But he came from nothing, so he was a self-made man. And so in this sort of humanism tradition, it seems interesting that he'd be interested in other people who came from nothing. So that also might be another explanation for this woman who doesn't seem to have been very wealthy, based on her trappings and her clothing. Moving from Florence and Milan and France, which were the haunts of Leonardo da Vinci, and now turning our focus and attention to Rome. This is a map of, a combination of ancient and Renaissance Rome. Over here is the sort of old city. This is where most of those Roman ruins are located, right in here. And just to give you an idea, here's the Pantheon. That's kind of located more centrally. And then out here, outside of the city walls, is the area known as St. Peter's Basilica and Vatican City. It didn't look like this at the time, though. This floor plan and area plan is of New St. Peter's, but this is just showing you that St. Peter's Basilica is located outside the city walls. This was Old St. Peter's. You probably covered it if you did take Art History 1, but if you didn't, it's a very good example of an early Christian basilica. Remember, we've talked about the basilicas before. Central nave area that are taller than the side aisles that come in at this lower elevation, so that there are areas right here for a clerestory row of windows that let lots and lots of light in. They're longitudinal, long basilicas, sometimes with an atria in front. This open air space in the front would have been open to the elements and probably had a fountain and some statues, and then leading up to the covered hall. Sometimes with what we call a transept, which this section is called the transept. It's the crossing of the basilica. It also sometimes serves to make the basilicas look like a cross, which we will talk about in a second. So the St. Peter's Basilica that was existing in Rome in the turnover from the Quattro to Cinquecento was this same Old St. Peter's Basilica, the same one dating from 333 to 390 CE, so from the time shortly after Constantine and his followers. It's the same building. It's decrepit at this point. It's been over 1,000 years. It's run down. It's way too small. Moral of the story, the popes decide that they need a new St. Peter's Basilica. They hire a couple of different architects, and they're going to see they kind of run through these different architects to come up with plans for new St. Peter's Basilica. Obviously, it's a logistical nightmare because they need to continue to have services throughout the rebuilding process. And we saw in the example of Brunelleschi's Duomo that it can take decades for architectural feats like this to be completed. So it really was a logistical nightmare. Also, they needed money. The church needed money to pay for it. At one point, they get a new pope in Rome, Julius II. Julius II comes into Rome, and he is the one who's going to decide that Rome needs to reclaim its supremacy as the capital for art and culture in the civilized European world. So he also has a quest for authority. He's also known as the warrior pope, but we don't need to learn about that part. He was an art patron for propaganda purposes. He wanted to increase the sale of indulgences. Indulgences are years that you can pay off of your sentence so you can get out of hell. Yeah, not good. It's an aspect of Catholicism that a lot of people very much disagreed with, that you can kind of buy your way out of hell. So he increased the sale of indulgences to try to fund his new building of St. Peter's Basilica. He hires Bramante, who comes up with the first of these architectural plans for New St. Peter's Basilica. You'll notice that Bramante's plan strays very much from the longitudinal access basilical hall of Old St. Peter's. He's no longer even really a basilica anymore, but it's a centrally accessed, so meaning that it's not long, it's not rectangular, it's square, cross shape. Lots of squares and circles. Remember we talked about with the Vitruvian Man how the Renaissance loves squares and circles. So this is Bramante's design for this high Renaissance form, this centrally planned, perfectly symmetrical square and circle complex. If you study it closely, you can see that it's a complex system of symmetries and sort of crystalline interlocking crosses. And it would have been topped with a dome. So this is going to be their dome. They want to rival that of Brunelleschi's dome in Florence, also rivaling that of the Pantheon, which already was in Rome. Bramante, unfortunately, is going to die before they can move forward with his plan, so eventually it does get passed on to other artists. But let's look at some of Bramante's work that actually did get completed. This is his Tempietto. Tempietto means a small temple. So this is a small temple dedicated to St. Peter's, and it's also in Vatican City in Rome. So he did manage to finish this one. If you look at the inside, you can see that this is a two-storied long cylinder. One long cylinder, perfectly round, but broken up into two even stories. So the diameter of the cylinder is as tall as the first floor or the first story is. Repeated again on the second story, and then topped by a lovely hemispherical dome. Proportions, rational architecture, things that break down to even units, and symmetry and balance is what the Renaissance is all about. He has his projecting sort of portico here, surrounded by columns, as well as a lovely balustrade up at the top. This is called a balustrade. It's, I guess you could call it a railing, basically, but they call it balustrades. I have on your list there architectural volume. It's hard to think about reading a building in terms of volume, but I want you to start to look at these buildings as areas of solids and voids, areas of space with architectural forms in them, like these columns, and areas of voids, like the space between the columns. And you can start to see that he has this very lovely pattern of space and voids that he creates to generate a rhythm in his composition. Again, also the very high Renaissance, the very late Renaissance love of squares, or of circles in this case. Let's move on from Bramante and start to talk about a young upstart of an artist who's starting to gain some recognition in Florence. His name was Michelangelo Buonarroti. If you are studying him, though, and studying the slide, you may just refer to him as Michelangelo, because that's what everyone knows him as. But technically, his last name was Buonarroti. Michelangelo was his first name. He's going to receive commissions from Julius II, but we're not quite there yet. Right now, we're still in his Florentine in his Florentine work. We know that we're looking at something made for Florence because, according to the title, this is supposed to be a sculpture of David. And we know already that the city of Florence loves statues of David. They already had several commissioned, one by Verrocchio and another by Donatello. Hopefully you remember this little fellow right here. Michelangelo draws as inspiration for his monumental nude statue of David. He draws from classical sculpture. He looks specifically at the Spear Bearer by Polykleitos, a statue that we have already covered and talked about in class as being a perfect example of the canon of proportions, the head being 1/7 of the body, and this excellent balance of symmetria or symmetry, and also a wonderful example of contrapposto. All of those elements we see displayed in Michelangelo's David. So he's looking at ancient sculpture for his inspiration in creating his own monumental nude. And in many ways actually, this Michelangelo's statue of David can be seen as a great humanistic statement because it's putting the beauty of humans, of mankind, primary, and making the perfect or ideal form of a human body their ideal form of beauty. You probably are saying to yourself, but Professor Meloche, this kind of looks a little messed up. Like, for example, why is his hand so giant right there? And why, why does his head look a little bit bigger? Well, when Michelangelo first started working on this large statue, he was commissioned to recycle this huge piece of marble, which they called the Giant. This giant block of marble was 17 feet high, so it's approximately the height of Michelangelo's David. He was commissioned to create a 17-foot high statue of David for the city of Florence, and it was supposed to go in their city hall, and it was supposed to be several stories up in the air. So it was supposed to be, project from one of these wall niches in their city hall up very high in the air. So when looking up at the statue from below, this hand actually would have looked because of the rules of foreshortening, it would have looked more accurate. Eventually, though, when he did unveil his statue, the city of Florence loved it so much that they didn't want to put it up high, and they kept it, they kept it outside, which kind of annoyed Michelangelo because he's sitting there saying, but I'd planned on having this up high, which is why I made his hand so big. But, I guess he took it as a compliment in the end. So 17-foot hall monumental nude humanist statement. David, in this case, we're not entirely sure if we're looking at a victorious David, the way that we saw in Donatello's David statue where he's standing on top of the slain head of Goliath. Are we looking at a victorious David, or are we looking at a David staring down his foe? He seems very calm and relaxed for a guy who's staring down Goliath. However, in his one hand here rests his slingshot over his shoulder. In the other hand, if you can rotate around the back, you'd be able to see that he has a rock in the hand. So this probably, in all likelihood, is an image of the David staring down his foe, not a victorious David. He's stoic, he's facing his challenge with the sort of stoic approach to enemies, this sort of balanced confidence that Michelangelo studied in classical sculpture. In classical sculpture, they never really let their emotions get the better of them. They're always shown as being very balanced and composed. And so that's the David that we're looking at here. This also is not a tiny little, 14-year-old or 16-year-old David, the skinny little David, but Michelangelo's David statue is it just seems to be far more mature in the proportions of and composition of his body and the development of his muscles and the symmetry and development of his pubic hair, which I always have to mention. When I was studying this piece in Italy with my little Italian art history professor, and he took us to go see this David statue. He's standing in front of it, and he starts going, and the the pubic hair explodes from the base of the penis like the flames of desire, and this adorable Italian accent, and everyone starts looking around like, oh yeah, he's talking about pubic hair. Yeah. If you rotate this statue, which I recommend that you do if you ever do see it in person, you can see the pubic hair continues around the back a little bit too. So it's just kind of just a fun detail. Michelangelo's David statue is very tense, right? Because he's supposed to be staring down his foe, but also kind of relaxed in a sense, especially in the gathering of his contrapposto, which is the fact that all of the weight is balanced on one foot, juts his hip out, and then his shoulder projects the other side, and his head turns to face his foe, while the other foot is relaxed and elevated, and the knee is bent. You can see Michelangelo also, similar to Leonardo da Vinci, interested in anatomy. Again, that's really what's going to differentiate the late Renaissance from the early Renaissance. In the late Renaissance, they study anatomy, and you can see everything from the details of the knees, the differences in these knees, to the veins in his hand, fingernail detail. He's got this lovely little V pelvic area going, then his side abs and rib cage. Everything is very anatomically correct. So he definitely did some studies from anatomy and some studies from real life to prepare for this David statue. And the fact that this monumental nude statue was erected in a civic city building is really telling about the general population's embracing of humanism at this point. Michelangelo makes such a stir with his David statue that he's also invited, as I said, to Rome by Julius II, and he gets the commission for a Pietà scene. We've seen Pietàs before, but not like this. Pietà is the scene in which Mary shares a moment with the dead Christ figure, an intimate, private moment between the two of them before they move Christ to the entombment scenes. So here's the figure of Mary with the dead Christ laying out across her lap. Same thing that we saw in Michelangelo's David. We see attention to anatomy. In this case, we're looking at a Christ figure who's emaciated and dead, so his muscles are limp, not engaged. And you can see this details like right under here, where her fingers are propping up his armpit. You can see his armpit, because it's limp and unengaged, is kind of flipped out like that. And his head juts out at this sort of unnatural angle, again, because he has no muscles to hold it up. Interest in anatomical detail in the tendons right here at the back of his knee, his foot ankles, the wounds in his hand, that kind of thing. This statue is an exquisite example of marble virtuosity. If you ever go to see it in person, however, you cannot get very close to it. It was defaced at one point, actually not that long ago. It was defaced. A guy I think it was in the 80s, came up to the Mary statue, and he took a hammer to it. And so this is what her face looked like after the damage, and this is what it looked like when they repaired it. So you can't get close to it anymore because some guy took, it might not have been a hammer, it might have been a shovel. Some guy took a shovel to it. The reason for doing so was, well, kind of clear. If you look at the details here, of this detail of Christ's face and this image of Mary's face, they don't appear to be that far apart in age. And many people thought that this was sort of heretical of him, that they would have them so close together, because the relationship between the two of them as she's holding him can be misconstrued. Or I guess it was misconstrued to this individual who decided he needed to take a hammer to her face. Very frustrating for art historians like you guys and me who have to deal with the repercussions of it, as in now when you can't go see it very close in person. You have to stand behind a huge pane of glass that's about 20 feet out. You can't see great details like her eyelids or her lips, or, Christ's mustache and his lips, and where Michelangelo signed it. Michelangelo Buonarroti signed the sash across Mary's chest. This is Michelangelo's Moses and Bound Slaves. Michelangelo was, Julius II, I should say, was so impressed by Michelangelo's sculptural work in his Pietà and for his David that he hired Michelangelo to start construction for his own tomb. So Julius II wanted to have a nice fancy tomb to be buried in Rome, and so he wanted lots of sculptural decoration for it. The theme that he chose for his sculptural decoration was Moses freeing the slaves, because he kind of saw himself as a Moses figure, this pope who's bringing the church into the world of the Renaissance, into the world of humanism. So this is Michelangelo's Moses. Michelangelo doesn't actually get to finish up the tomb because Julius II kind of runs out of money, but he does finish this statue of Moses, and some of these slaves still remain in states of incompletion, unfortunately. This figure of Moses is a little bit more bulky than our figure of David, and there's a very interesting reason for that. In 1505 or 1506, Michelangelo is present for the uncovering and unveiling of this statue. This statue is from Hellenistic Greece, and it was found in Rome. Hellenism, if you're not familiar with the term, is the period that comes after classical Greece. It's during the Hellenistic reign that bodies start to get much more exaggerated in their musculature at the point of being sort of unrealistic. Bodies start to take on these twisted contortion body positions. They call it figura serpentina because of the way that the body tends to sort of swirl around in this very dramatic form. It's figura serpentina. It comes from the Latin for serpentine or snake-like figure. And it's also during this point in time in Hellenism that art gets much more emotionally dramatic. So we talked about classical art is always very stoic and reserved. In Hellenistic art, they get very emotionally dramatic. Well, Michelangelo was here for the unveiling of this statue as they found it in Rome. He was there as they uncovered it. And unfortunately, he did not have an art historian, a lovely art history professor like you guys do, to tell him that this technically was from the Hellenistic period. When he saw it, he thought it was an example of Greek classical art. And so it's after 1505 that Michelangelo starts to show figures and bodies that are much more muscular than his David. And this Moses is an excellent example of that. He's just far more strong. This is Moses in context, but many of these statues were finished by other artists. These are some of his slaves, which are now in the Louvre. This one you can see definitely unfinished. Michelangelo was, obviously depressed that his commission for Pope Julius II's tomb did not work out the way that he wanted it to. So Pope Julius II, as a consolation prize, gives him the Sistine Chapel ceiling to paint. Popes had been working on the decoration of this small private chapel off the side of St. Peter's Basilica for quite some time. You may remember we discussed in our last chapter this scene right here, kind of peeking out of the corner. This is Perugino Christ giving the keys to St. Peter. The ceiling of the Sistine Chapel at the time, though, was just plain blue when Michelangelo comes, but he gets commissioned to paint the entire ceiling, which he actually was not happy about. It's around this time that Michelangelo starts turning into a very whiny artist, and he complains about it because he says that he did not like painting as much as he liked sculpture. He said that sculpture reminded him of the act of God, creating man, from form, from rock, from stone, from clay. And painting, he said, was just too imitative, and he didn't like it. And he probably didn't like it also because actually he really wasn't as good at painting as he was at sculpture, but he would never have said that. He gets the commission for the ceiling, and he complains also the entire time that he's painting it. That's actually more understandable. They built him scaffolding at first, but he needed to stand underneath and lift his head and tilt his head upwards to look up at the ceiling and paint up. And that became so uncomfortable to him because you'll see that it takes him about 5 years to complete this whole thing. It becomes so uncomfortable to him eventually that they build him flat scaffolding so that he can lay on his back and paint that way. So flat scaffolding that sits up higher so that he was able to complete it. And he said that his back was never the same after painting this ceiling. that he always had health issues after this. Again, complained a lot. So we're going to look here at this ceiling, which was all Michelangelo above this point, right above this drink horse right here. Ignore for the time being this back panel. Yes, technically that is Michelangelo also, but that was done at a much later commission, and it's actually in a slightly different style. It's a late Michelangelo style that's not quite the same. So ignore it just for the time being. Julius II, as a humanist pope, as a pope who is interested in humanism, decided to give Michelangelo a lot of leeway in his depictions for the Sistine Chapel ceiling. He didn't give him a commission in which he explained what he wanted. He let Michelangelo choose. Michelangelo worked in conjunction or in association with a church theologian, with a historian that was working with the church, but that theologian himself was also a humanist. And so if you look through the Sistine Chapel ceiling, you start to notice that on all of the scenes in the main scenes going across the middle and in the outer scenes, you actually don't have any references to the New Testament. Absolutely no references at all whatsoever to Christ or any of the apostles or anything from the New Testament. It's all scenes from the Old Testament, moving from this area and back this way. You have the creation of the world from the book of Genesis to the creation of original sin. Moving outside and around to these triangular sections, you have Sibyls. Ibyls. Sibyls were ancient prophets. So we're talking about classical Greek and Roman classical prophets from mythology that were seen to have maybe foretold the coming of Christ, these prophets that talk about a hero or something like that, but still technically from classical mythology. And then you also have prophets from the Old Testament as well. So Greek prophets, Old Testament prophets. Surrounding and filling in all of these architecturally painted trompe-l'oeil details, you have small cupids and random nude figures. These small cupids that you see here and here and here that are architecturally sort of supporting the trompe-l'oeil or the trick of the eye string horse that's going across here. They're called putti, P-U-T-T-I. And they're just small little babies. They come from cupids, small cupids basically. And then these nude figures that just kind of lounge around and look at the different scenes. I mean, really, they play no narrative part in the composition whatsoever. They're just there to be nudes, and they're called ignudi. It's Italian for, nude figures. Singular is ignudo. We're going to look at a detail of this scene right here, which is the creation of the sun, moon, and planets. And then after that, we're going to look at a detail of this scene right here. Now, this scene is the one that's going to be starred. So even though this scene is the only one that you need to recognize and memorize, you probably are going to want to make mention of the overall composition of the Sistine Chapel ceiling as well. So just giving you guys a heads up. I should also mention the theological doctrine that's associated with the Sistine Chapel ceiling, because that also is quite brilliant. If you follow the story as it progresses, you'll see that we move from the creation of the world and the creation of man to the creation of original sin and the casting out from the Garden of Eden. The area directly below the casting out of the Garden of Eden and the creation of original sin is the area where they would have had the communion for the weekly Eucharist. And the weekly Eucharist, if you're familiar with the Catholic practice, is supposed to be the opportunity for you to cast off your original sin when you take the weekly communion. So it's interesting that he first leads us to sin in the story, and then if you were present in the chapel, you would have received salvation. Here's Michelangelo's creation of the sun and the moon. So it's God separating the sun and the moon as part of the book of Exodus. This is his figure of God, very much this Hellenistic, overly bulky mass figure that definitely shows a lot of influence from his study of the Laocoon, which is that statue that we just looked at with his figura serpentina, right? This is not a relaxed contrapposto pose, but a swooping, dramatic, dynamic pose, and also a little bit more emotion in his face. Again, sort of probably borrowing that from the Laocoon as well. Here you can see details of the Ignudi. The presence of all of these just nude figures all over the place is very telling again of the humanism that has now made its way to the church thanks to popes like Julius II. And nowhere is it more prominent than in Michelangelo's creation of Adam for his Sistine Chapel ceiling. This is a true humanist statement that he's making. It's a great humanist statement. Because we have God literally in the process of breathing life or creating Adam. So in the story of creation, in the book of Genesis from the Old Testament, God takes a lump of clay and forms it into his own image and then breathes life into him. So that's the moment that we're looking at right here. I really can't emphasize enough this quality of being in his own image. God is creating this lump of form in God's own image. So that means that human beings look like God and God looks like human beings. That's the statement that Michelangelo is trying to make here, and so strongly. He's emphasizing that the human body, the nude human body, is as close to the divine as we can see in our daily lives because God made us in his own image. So in a way, Michelangelo is saying, what could possibly be shameful about having a nude in church? Because it's the body that God created, again, in his own image. So that's this really powerful moment for humanism. It's incredibly important. The other things that you could mention, I mean, the body itself is getting a little bit, it's a study of anatomy for sure, but maybe a little bit too lumpy in some of these in some of these body muscles, a little bit too muscular, again showing his study of the Laocoon, and also probably because he was kind of rushing through it. But this moment of touch, this touch symbol here is the symbol and sign of the Renaissance, that now that God and mankind are connected, and that there's nothing shameful about that relationship, and that the power that God gives mankind includes the power to make our own fate and our own decisions and to bring about progress in the world, as long as we're keeping with the rules of good versus evil. God and Adam here are also confronting each other on an almost even plane. Almost even, got slightly above him, but the line is definitely going across the line of power. Just to show you guys a point of comparison, this is a medieval door from the doors of St. Hildesheim in Germany. So this is from like the 13th century. Or maybe the 14th century. It's the same scene, God breathing life into Adam. So this is the lump of clay. This is God bending over to breathe life into him. This is certainly not a humanistic statement. God is above. God has a giant halo. Adam is, he doesn't even really have anatomical parts, much less accurate depictions of anatomy. So it's just a point of comparison. I've also heard, a lot of theories about the figures in the background. I've heard that the cloud of fabric looks a lot like a brain because of Michelangelo's study of anatomy. I've also heard that this female figure right here might be Lilith, who in some stories was Adam's first wife, that apparently she also was created from clay, but she gave Adam too much back talk, and so God brought her back up to heaven and then made Eve. So Lilith is an interesting figure as well. So we have this a symbol of humanism. We have characteristics of the late Renaissance in the attention to anatomy, in the putting of Adam on the equal picture plane with God, who actually, because of the beard, looks a lot like figures of Zeus from Greek mythology. You also have the presence of these ignudi, which were all over the place. And all of this nudity shows you that this is the moment when the church is going to get on board with humanism, because they really can't deny the virtuosity of the human body when it was supposed to be made, according to their own book that they follow, made in God's image. The Sistine Chapel was cleaned in the 1980s, so if you ask your parents if they've ever been to Rome and seen the Sistine Chapel ceiling, you need to ask what year they were there, because if they were there before the 80s, this is what they saw. A big smoky black mess because of years of lighting candles, and just dirt that accumulated over the years. This is what it looked like in the 1980s. They cleaned it during the 80s and underwent a subsequent sort of whitewashing and scrubbing, and so this is what it looks like today. Honestly, if you ask me, I think it was over cleaned. I think that they got rid of any good examples of chiaroscuro, but that's just if you ask me.